I had been to Ryan's house so many times that it felt like an extension of my own life, a place where everything was predictable, easy, and safe. The familiar creak of the front door, the faint scent of coffee that always seemed to linger in the air, and the low hum of the television in the living room were constants I never questioned. Ryan would usually be sprawled across the couch, laughing too loudly at something stupid, while I sat beside him, half listening, half living in my own head. It was simple. It was normal. That night was supposed to be no different. "About time you showed up," Ryan called out as I stepped inside, tossing me a grin that carried years of friendship in it. I rolled my eyes, dropping my bag near the door. "Relax. I'm 10 minutes late, not a week." He laughed, pulling me into the living room, already talking about something that didn't matter. I nodded along, letting his voice fill the space, grounding me in something familiar. That's what Ryan had always been, steady, uncomplicated, easy to understand. Unlike his dad, Daniel had always been there in the background of our lives, a quiet presence that never demanded attention but somehow commanded it anyway. He wasn't overly strict or particularly warm. Just distant, like someone who was physically present but mentally somewhere else entirely. I noticed him the moment I stepped into the room. He was sitting in his usual chair, one arm resting against the side, his posture relaxed but his expression unreadable. His eyes flicked toward me briefly, offering the smallest nod. "Ethan," he said, his voice calm, measured. "Hey, Mr. Carter," I replied automatically. That was how it always went. Polite, brief, nothing more, and yet, something about that moment lingered longer than it should have. I told myself it was nothing. Ryan dragged me upstairs not long after, eager to show me something on his laptop, and for a while, everything slipped back into place. We joked, argued over dumb things, and lost track of time the way we always did. Hours passed without meaning, but eventually, Ryan got distracted, he always did. A call, a message, something that pulled his attention away completely. He stepped out onto the balcony, leaving me alone in his room with the dull glow of the screen and the quiet hum of the house. I didn't think much of it when I got up. "I'll be back," I muttered, though he barely heard me. The hallway was dim, lit only by a soft yellow light from downstairs. I moved without thinking, my steps slow, almost automatic, until I reached the kitchen. And that's when I saw him again. Daniel stood by the counter, a glass in his hand, the faint clink of ice breaking the silence. He didn't look surprised to see me, which somehow made it worse. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, though it wasn't late enough for that to make sense. I shook my head. "Just needed water." He nodded slightly, as if that answer was enough, though his eyes didn't leave me. I crossed the room, suddenly aware of every small movement, every sound. The way the floor shifted under my weight. The way my hand hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching for a glass. It shouldn't have felt like this. He was just Ryan's dad. But when I turned around, glass in hand, I realized he was still watching me. Not casually, not absent-mindedly, intently. The kind of look that made you pause, that made you question whether you had missed something important. "Is something wrong?" I asked, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. For a second, he didn't answer. His gaze held mine, steady and unreadable, yet somehow heavier than anything I could name. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No," he said quietly. But the way he said it didn't feel like the truth. Something shifted in that moment. Subtle, almost invisible, but undeniable. The air felt thicker, the silence sharper, as if the space between us had changed in a way I couldn't explain. I looked away first. It felt like the only thing I could do. "Good night," I muttered, setting the glass down half full before turning toward the stairs. "Ethan." His voice stopped me mid-step. I turned back, my pulse suddenly louder than it should have been. For a brief second, it looked like he was going to say something more, something that mattered. But whatever it was, he held it back. "Nothing," he said after a pause. I nodded, even though the word didn't sit right. And as I walked back upstairs, back to Ryan, back to everything that was supposed to make sense, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just begun. Because that look, that wasn't something you imagined. And it definitely wasn't something you forgot. The next morning should have erased everything. Sunlight streamed through Ryan's curtains in that careless, ordinary way, cutting across the room as if nothing had changed. Ryan was already awake, scrolling through his phone, completely unaware of how the night before had lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest. Dude, you stayed up too late again, he said, glancing at me. You look like you barely slept. I forced a shrug, rubbing my eyes. I'm fine. It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. I just didn't understand why I felt so off balance, like something inside me had shifted out of place. Ryan didn't question it. He never did. That was part of what made being around him so easy. He accepted things as they appeared, never looking too closely beneath the surface. I envied that. We spent the morning the same way we always did, half lazy, half aimless, moving between conversations that didn't matter. But no matter how much I tried to lose myself in it, my thoughts kept drifting back to the kitchen, to that moment, to the way Daniel had looked at me like he was seeing something new. Or maybe like he had always seen it, and I was only just noticing. I told myself I was overthinking it. That explanation held, until I went downstairs. Daniel was at the table, a cup of coffee in front of him, his attention fixed on something in his hands. He looked up as I entered, and for a brief second, something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or something sharper. Morning, he said. Morning, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I moved toward the counter, deliberately casual, but I could feel it again, that awareness, like a thread pulling tight between us. Sleep okay? He asked. The question was simple, but the way he said it wasn't. Yeah, I answered, even though the word felt thin. His gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary before he nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee. It should have ended there. But it didn't. Ryan's voice echoed from upstairs, calling my name, and I turned instinctively toward the sound. As I did, my hand brushed against the edge of the counter, too close to where Daniel was sitting. It was nothing, except it wasn't, because his hand moved too. Not enough to be obvious. Not enough to be undeniable. Just enough that our fingers almost touched. Almost. I pulled back first, the movement quick, instinctive, like I had nearly crossed into something I didn't understand. Neither of us said anything. But the silence that followed felt louder than any conversation. I left the kitchen without looking back. The rest of the day blurred together, but the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. Every glance felt loaded, every small interaction stretched thin with something unspoken. By the afternoon, I was hyper-aware of him. The way Daniel moved through the house with quiet control. The way his voice remained calm, even when Ryan got too loud. The way his attention seemed divided, part of him present, part of him somewhere else entirely. And yet, every now and then, I caught him looking at me. Not by accident, not casually, deliberately. Each time, I told myself it didn't mean anything. Each time, I felt less certain. Earth to Ethan, Ryan snapped, waving a hand in front of my face. Where'd you go? I blinked, forcing a laugh. Nowhere. He frowned slightly, studying me for a moment before shrugging it off. You've been weird all day. I'm not weird, I said quickly. Yeah, okay, he muttered, clearly unconvinced. Guilt twisted in my chest, sharp and immediate. Ryan trusted me. That had always been the foundation of everything, years of friendship built on something solid, something uncomplicated. And now, for the first time, I felt like I was standing just outside of that, looking in. Not because of something I had done, but because of something I couldn't ignore. That night, I told myself I'd keep my distance. It should have been easy. Stay in Ryan's room. Avoid unnecessary interactions. Pretend everything was normal until it actually felt that way again. But sometime after midnight, the house grew too quiet. Ryan had fallen asleep, his breathing slow and steady, the soft glow of his phone still lighting up the edge of the bed. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to force my thoughts into something manageable. It didn't work. Eventually, I gave in, pushing the covers back and slipping out of the room. The hallway felt different at night, quieter, heavier, like it was holding on to something. I already knew where I was going. And part of me hated that I didn't stop myself. The kitchen light was on. Of course it was. Daniel stood by the counter again, almost exactly where he had been the night before, as if time had folded in on itself. This time, he didn't look surprised at all. You couldn't sleep, he said, his voice low, certain. It wasn't a question. I hesitated in the doorway, every instinct telling me to turn around, to walk away before this became something real. But I didn't move. Yeah, I admitted quietly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel set his glass down, his gaze locking onto mine with a clarity that made it impossible to pretend anymore. "You keep looking at me like you want to ask something," he said. My breath caught, sharp and sudden. "I don't, Ethan." The way he said my name stopped me completely. Not firm, not harsh, just knowing. The space between us felt smaller somehow, charged with something I couldn't define but couldn't ignore either. "What are we doing?" I asked before I could stop myself. The question hung in the air, heavier than anything that had come before. Daniel didn't answer right away. But he didn't look away either. And somehow, that felt like an answer all on its own. Daniel didn't answer my question right away, and the silence stretched long enough to feel deliberate. "What are we doing?" I repeated, quieter this time, as if lowering my voice might somehow soften the weight of it. He exhaled slowly, running a hand across the back of his neck, a gesture that made him seem less composed than usual. "That depends," he said finally, his tone measured but no longer distant. "What do you think we're doing?" The question unsettled me more than any answer could have. I hesitated, searching for something that made sense, something that could still be undone. "I think this is a mistake." Even as I said it, I didn't move. Daniel noticed. A faint, almost imperceptible shift crossed his expression, like he understood the contradiction before I did. "Then why are you still standing there?" he asked quietly. I didn't have a response for that. Because the truth was, I didn't want to leave. That realization settled heavily in my chest, pressing against everything I thought I understood about myself, about Ryan, about right and wrong. It would have been easier if this felt forced, if Daniel had crossed a line I could clearly define and reject. But he hadn't. If anything, he was waiting. And that made it worse. "I should go back upstairs," I said, though the words lacked conviction. Daniel nodded once, as if agreeing. "You probably should." Neither of us moved. The distance between us remained unchanged, yet it felt smaller, like something invisible had closed the gap without permission. I became acutely aware of every detail, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the house, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. "You didn't imagine it," Daniel said suddenly. My eyes snapped back to him. "What?" "That look," he clarified, his voice steady now, certain in a way that stripped away any remaining doubt. "Last night. This morning. You didn't imagine any of it." The words landed exactly where I had been trying not to look. "Why?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't even anger. Just confusion. Daniel held my gaze, and for the first time, there was no distance left in it. "Because I noticed you," he said. Simple, direct, dangerous. A strange mix of heat and unease twisted inside me, pulling me forward even as everything else told me to step back. "I'm Ryan's friend," I said, like that alone should have been enough to stop this. "I know," Daniel replied. "And you're—" I cut myself off, unable to finish the sentence without making it real. "I know," he repeated, softer this time. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. "Then why does it feel like you don't care?" I asked, the edge in my voice sharper than I intended. Something flickered across his face, brief, but unmistakable. Not indifference. Not carelessness. Conflict. "I do care," he said, and there was something honest in it that made it harder to dismiss. "That's why I haven't done anything." The words hung between us, loaded with everything they implied. "Not yet," I said before I could think better of it. The moment the words left my mouth, the air shifted. Daniel's expression tightened slightly, his gaze sharpening in a way that made my pulse spike. "Is that what you think this is?" he asked. "I don't know what this is," I admitted. That was the most honest thing I had said all night. For a second, neither of us spoke. The tension didn't break, it deepened, settling into something heavier, something that demanded an answer even if neither of us was ready to give one. Then Daniel took a step closer. It wasn't sudden or aggressive. If anything, it was careful, deliberate, like he was giving me time to react, to stop him. I didn't. My breath caught as the space between us narrowed, every instinct clashing at once. I could walk away. I knew I could, but I didn't move. "Ethan," he said quietly, my name carrying a weight that made it feel different coming from him. I swallowed hard. "This is wrong." "Yes," he agreed. The fact that he didn't deny it should have made it easier to leave. It didn't, because even as he acknowledged it, he didn't step back. And neither did I. The moment stretched, balanced on something fragile and irreversible. I could feel it, the exact point where everything could still be undone, where one step in either direction would decide what came next. Say something, I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I wanted to hear. Daniel didn't answer with words. Instead, his hand moved, slow enough that I could have stopped it, deliberate enough that I knew he wasn't hesitating anymore. His fingers brushed lightly against my wrist, barely there, yet enough to send a sharp jolt through me. That was it. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a touch, but it was enough, because in that moment, the line wasn't just blurred anymore. It was crossed. I exhaled shakily, my mind racing to catch up with something my body had already decided. We shouldn't. I know, Daniel said again, though his hand didn't move away. The contradiction hit harder this time. We both knew exactly what this meant. We both knew who it involved. And still, I didn't pull back. The realization settled in, quiet but undeniable. This wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't misinterpretation or imagination. This was a choice. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to make a different one. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked faintly. The sound snapped through the moment like a warning. Daniel's hand dropped instantly, the space between us widening as quickly as it had closed. His expression shifted, the conflict returning, sharper now, harder to ignore. Go back upstairs, he said, his voice low but firm. I didn't argue. I turned, my heart pounding, each step heavier than the last as I moved away from the kitchen, away from him, away from something I couldn't undo. But as I reached the top of the stairs, one thought refused to leave me. That hadn't been an accident. And next time, I wasn't sure either of us would stop. The house felt different the next morning. Nothing had physically changed, the same walls, the same muted light filtering through the curtains, the same quiet hum of everyday life, but something beneath it all had shifted, like a foundation no one else could see beginning to crack. I noticed it the moment I opened my eyes. Ryan was still asleep, sprawled across the bed in the same careless way he always was, completely unaware of how close everything had come to breaking. I watched him for a moment, a dull weight settling in my chest. He trusted me. That thought lingered longer than anything else. I turned away, sitting up slowly, pressing my hands against my face as if that might steady something inside me. It didn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it again, the brief pressure of Daniel's fingers against my wrist, the quiet certainty in his voice, the way neither of us had really tried to stop what was happening. It would have been easier if it had gone further. At least then, the line would have been clear. But this lingering, unfinished tension, felt worse. Ethan. Ryan's voice broke through my thoughts, thick with sleep. I dropped my hands immediately, forcing myself to look normal. Yeah, you okay? He asked, pushing himself up on one elbow, his expression slightly confused. You look off. There it was again. That simple, honest concern. I managed a small shrug. Just tired. Ryan studied me for a second longer than usual, like he was trying to decide whether to push further. For a moment, I thought he might. Then he didn't. Come on, he said instead, stretching. Let's get something to eat. I nodded, grateful for the escape, even if it didn't feel like one. Because I already knew what waited downstairs. Daniel was in the kitchen. Of course he was, but this time, he didn't look at me. Not when we walked in. Not when Ryan started talking, filling the space with his usual easy energy. Not even when I deliberately moved closer than necessary, testing something I didn't fully understand. Nothing. It was like the night before hadn't happened. Like the tension, the quiet understanding, the moment that had almost turned into something irreversible, none of it had ever existed. And somehow, that felt worse. You good, Dad? Ryan asked casually, grabbing something from the fridge. Yeah, Daniel replied, his tone neutral, his focus fixed anywhere but me. I watched him carefully, searching for any sign of what I had seen before, any hint that I hadn't imagined it all. There was nothing. The control in his expression was absolute now, every trace of conflict buried so deeply it might as well not have existed. It shouldn't have bothered me. But it did. More than I expected. The rest of the morning passed in fragments, conversations slipping past me without meaning. Ryan laughed, joked, moved through everything like he always did, while I stayed just slightly out of sync, caught between what had happened and what was being ignored. And Daniel, he stayed distant, not cold, not harsh, just unreachable. Like a door that had been briefly opened and then firmly shut. By the time I left the house, the weight of it had settled into something heavier, something harder to ignore. Ryan walked me to the door, still talking about plans, about things that belonged to a version of life that felt just out of reach now. "Text me later," he said, nudging my shoulder lightly. "You've been weird today." I forced a faint smile. "Yeah, I will." Quote. He didn't question it, he never did. That was the problem. I stepped outside, the air cooler than I expected, and for a moment, I thought that would be the end of it. That distance would fix something, that leaving would put everything back where it belonged. But just as I reached the edge of the driveway, I felt it. That same awareness. I turned before I could stop myself. Daniel was standing in the doorway, watching me. The distance between us should have made it easier, should have softened whatever this was into something manageable. It didn't, because this time, there was no ambiguity in his expression. No confusion, no hesitation, just something quiet and unresolved, lingering beneath the surface like a question neither of us had answered. For a long second, neither of us moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. Not in denial, not in dismissal, but like he was trying to convince himself of something. And just like that, he stepped back, the door closing between us with a quiet finality. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, staring at the space where he had been, my thoughts tangled in something I couldn't untangle. That should have been the end of it. It felt like an ending. But it wasn't, because as I walked away, one thing became painfully clear. Whatever had started between us hadn't disappeared. It had only gone silent. And silence, I realized, could be far more dangerous than anything we had almost said.